Hello to everyone in the Holy Trinity Greek Orthodox Cathedral community and all of our friends. This is Father Jonathan. I hope you're doing well. Today we're going to continue our weekly series, Sunday Scripture with Father Jonathan, with a meditation on today's epistle and gospel reading. Today's epistle comes from St. Paul's letter to the Colossians, chapter 4, verses 5 through 11 and 14 through 18. And it's a really interesting passage. It's talking to us and encouraging us to live in a way that will be received positively by those who are outside the Christian community. And I think we can recognize a reality that takes place very often in our society, where it's often Christians who drive other people away from Christian life because of hypocrisy, because of bias, because of bigotedness, because of not having real understanding and real love for our neighbor. And so we hear in today's epistle, Paul say, "Brethren, conduct yourselves wisely towards outsiders, making the most of the time. Let your speech always be gracious, seasoned with salt, so that you may know how you ought to answer everyone." So we are called to be mindful of the way that we speak to those who are outside of the Christian community, outside of our Orthodox faith. If we want to share the good news of salvation, if we want to share the truth that we hold to as Orthodox Christians, we have to be mindful of the way that we communicate with other people. Not just in word, I would say, but clearly we need to also consider the ways in which we are acting, the words that we speak in action rather than just oral words. And so we need to be, as St. Paul says, gracious always and seasoned with salt. Now, what does that mean? Well, we're reminded in this phrase of something that Christ says in the 5th chapter of the Gospel according to Matthew, in a section called the Sermon on the Mount. In a video series, I talked about the Beatitudes, which immediately precede this. But he says to his disciples, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its saltiness, what good is it? It will be thrown out and trampled underfoot." To be salt really, truly means to preserve the liveliness of something. Salt was used medicinally. It was also used to cure and preserve food in a time when you were very much living in a subsistence culture. What you caught, what you grew, is what you ate. There wasn't a grocery store where we could get everything that we needed every single day, 24 hours a day. You had to catch and cure and preserve your food. And so to be the salt of the earth, to be seasoned with salt, is to be a preservative of life, a preservative in the process of subsistence, in this case, spiritual subsistence. And if we are prepared in this way, prepared to season the world with our spiritual life, we will also know what to say to others in order to share with them, to speak wisely. That means to speak with wisdom, divinely inspired insight into the truth of God, the gospel. To share with others wisely is to share an inspired word about who God is and who we are in relationship to God. Now, the gospel reading is connected with this in a very important way. Now, the gospel reading comes from the Gospel according to Luke, chapter 10, verses 16 through 21. We're in the period of the year when we're reading the Gospel of Luke most regularly. And so this is another Sunday of the Gospel according to Luke. And the Lord begins this pericope, this selection. He who rejects you rejects me, and he who rejects me rejects him who sent me. Now, we are already familiar from the epistle reading that we are called to be wise in our speech. We are called to be gracious and seasoned with salt, especially to those that we're communicating the gospel with. And Christ reminds us of why. And this is a twofold challenge, I believe, because he tells us, he who hears you hears me, and he who rejects you rejects me. So therefore, when we speak, we need to be mindful of what we are communicating, because we are representatives of Christ. We are members of Christ's body, his very body in the world. And therefore, when we speak, when we live our life of faith, we are seen as Christ's. We are seen as belonging to Christ. And therefore, the way we conduct ourselves gives rise in the minds and hearts of others of who Christ is. And so this is a devastatingly difficult challenge, because we are perhaps the first and primary experience of a Christ-like presence in the midst of someone's life. But at the same time, if we say or claim or presume to be Christ-like presences in the midst of the world, and we are not acting in Christ-like ways, people might presume, wrongfully of course, that this is who Christ is. When we're bigoted or biased or angry or judgmental, when we're doing all those things that are antithetical to our life of virtue, the life to which we are called, people will presume that that's what Christians are. They're hypocrites, and therefore won't want to join themselves to Christ, albeit a Christ of their imagining based on how they've received us. Now, the other end of the spectrum is the reality that we are communicating Christ to the world. And so we have to be mindful of knowing truly who Christ is, something that can only happen through cultivating a real relationship with Christ, a life of faith informed by Christian doctrine and practice, and our receiving of the sacraments in this sacramental life of the church. In all of these ways, we come to know Christ, and we are able to communicate with him by his grace. We are able to communicate him to others because we are members of him. And that's the essential aspect here. We have to grow in our connection, our unity, our union, our communion with God and with one another, if we are going to speak the truth in love to others in a way that they will hear. But the reality is, not everyone will hear, and not everyone will receive the good word. And the truth of the matter is, those who reject Christ's word by rejecting the authentic teachings of Christ that have been preserved or transmitted through the apostles and preserved in the church, they are rejecting Christ. They're rejecting God. And ultimately, as he says, he who rejects me, who rejects Christ, rejects the one who sent me, who is God the Father. Now, all of this being said, we are, of course, representatives of Christ. We are his members working in the midst of the world. We are continuing his salvific action in the midst of the world by the communication of the gospel. And this, throughout the centuries, nearly 2 millennia, have produced a way of life that has cultivated in the church beautiful saints that are capable of performing miraculous things. And in today's gospel reading, in addition to this reminder that we have to preach Christ and we have to make sure that we're preaching authentically, that's what we're hearing in the epistle, we also are reminded that we can't let this go to our heads. Christ gives a very specific example in response to what the 70 apostles, there's the 12 apostles and the apostles of the 70, another 70 who were sent out in pairs. When they returned after being sent out, they were rejoicing, saying, Lord, even the demons are subject to us in your name. Now, this is a beautiful thing. They are able to cast out unclean spirits. They're able, of course, to heal people, they've heard. But Christ subtly rebukes them for a very significant thing. He says to them, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. Behold, I have given you authority to tread upon serpents and scorpions and over all the powers of the enemy, and nothing shall hurt you. Nevertheless, do not rejoice in this, that the spirits are subject to you, but rejoice that your names are written in heaven. He's reminding the disciples that even if miraculous things happen in Christ's name, they can't let it go to their heads. Even if the kingdom of Satan, which Christ is alluding to, there's kind of a threefold understanding of I saw Satan fall like lightning. The first and foremost is a historic event in cosmic history of the fall of Satan. There's the reality that Christ was witness, just like he knew when power was going forth from him as he was walking in the crowd and the woman with the issue of the blood touched his garment and she was immediately healed, and he said, who touched me? And his disciples were like, there's lots of people around you, and you ask who touched you, and he said, I felt power go forth from me. So Christ was aware that in his name, in the power given to him from his Father from all eternity, being his eternal Son, and given freely to the disciples, that power was overcoming the power of Satan, but also a broader sense now and into the future that Satan's kingdom is losing its authority on earth. For the kingdom of heaven is taking its rightful place on earth, and humanity is being joined to God, a God that humanity rejected in the garden. So he's saying, oh yes, all of this is true, but let's not rejoice in these miraculous things. Let's not rejoice in these miraculous things, but rather rejoice that your names are written in heaven. So what do we rejoice in all of this? Do we rejoice that we have wisdom to speak wondrous things to those and people convert to Christianity or Orthodoxy because of it? Do we rejoice because we perform miracles? Or do we rejoice because there is salvation? And this is what Christ is reminding us. The ultimate good, the ultimate thing that we strive for is not to have superpowers. It's not to be able to cast out demons or being great speakers or anything like that, or to share the gospel unencumbered by our fumbling words. No, the reality is what we rejoice in is the truth of the gospel, that we have received salvation and our names are written in heaven. And so this is where we stand. This is what today's epistle and gospel might be speaking to us today. We must communicate the gospel. We must do so wisely and therefore be inspired and strive to live our lives so that this inspiration is manifested in our hearts and in our minds and in our speech and in our action. We need to be prudent in how we speak to others. We need to be prepared and have our hearts and minds and lives seasoned with salt so that we can be salt that seasons the world, and so that others will receive us, and so that we will know what to say when questioned by others. Because we are Christ's representatives. When people hear us speak, if they are hearing us speak, when we bear the name Christian, they presume that we are speaking on God's behalf. And therefore, we want to make sure the words that we are saying are the words of truth, the words of life, the words of love, and not our own misguided words, so that if they hear it, they're hearing truth, and they are more likely to receive it than reject it, so that they are not rejecting Christ because of our shortcomings, our failures to communicate the truth of the gospel in ways that they will hear. And in all of this, we must rejoice always, not boastfully in those miraculous things that happen by God's grace through us, but in the reality of salvation, in the reality that we have the capacity by God's grace to be in communion with God and live eternally in God's embrace. God bless you. We're here for you. We love you. Don't hesitate to reach out. Call us, email us, leave us a note on social media, send us a message in the comments, leave a message in the comment section. We really appreciate it if you would help us extend our reach of these videos and other online offerings we have by liking and subscribing to our YouTube channel and sharing our YouTube channel with those who you think might benefit from any of the offerings that we have. We also ask that you follow us on social media, on Instagram and Facebook. And in addition to that, if you would like to support us financially, there will be a link below where you can do that. Again, God bless you. Have a beautiful rest of your day and a wonderful and blessed start to your week.